Mediterranean. I think this is one of the arguments that Seth and also Gordon and Purcell and others have tried to distinguish both history of a place and the history in a place. One of these are people living in a place we call the Mediterranean, they have a history. Moroccan Jews have a history. And a conceptual notion of the Mediterranean as being characterized by certain things, and really the history of that characterization, the history of the people who are exemplars of that characterization. Yes, yes.
I have a question that I do not fully know how to formulate. It happens very often to me.
I will answer in kind.
Yes, no, it's more like you help me formulate the question. But you suggested us 4 articles to read. One of them is Máximo Diago Hernando on Calatayud. 2 others were about Goitine's book. And I just want to ask you something that is related to what you just talked about. There are 2 different problems. One is the poetics of a society in a very small community, but very important, like Calatayud. And how did the Jews of Calatayud live their life as Jews? And there is another one that is Jews in the history of the Mediterranean or in the history in the Mediterranean. And Goitine's book, the 2 articles you suggested about Goitine's book, they both underscore Mediterranean, but they do not ask the question of why a Mediterranean society. What does it mean to build a Mediterranean society? What kind of poetics of society is that particular one, and how it differs from these other poetics of society in Calatayud? So actually there are 2 completely different historical problems, I believe. And one of them is about how to relate these poetics of society to a space that is extremely loaded with lineage, history, family, economy, but in a very, very local way. And the other one is about, Homer said that the Mediterranean, the sea, is sterile. But there is the contrary to fertility. That there is nothing. There is no other line than the lines of the marteloio, no? of the communication, the ships, etc. There is nothing. There is no local. There is no actual society because it's water. It's an interesting difference of this poetic of society. So I would like to know, how do you relate to these 2 projects, so different and so complex about these poetics of society?
I don't relate to Homer, sorry. I'd have to think more about that, but I really don't. So I'll leave that aside. I think a couple of the articles, the one by Astrin and the one by Goldberg, are trying to ask, what is the meaning of Goitine's Mediterranean society today?
Right.
Can we still draw? I mean, there's a ton of information there, which he gathers and presents to us in a beautiful way. That still, of course, is fair fodder for our own projects. But what do we do with his theory that this raw data suggests the presence of a Mediterranean society, and his suggestion that the Jewish world of the medieval Mediterranean, at least during those centuries, was somewhat represented by, if not synonymous with, that Mediterranean society. They're questioning sort of how we read Goitine in this age. I wanted to raise that as an issue for people. I don't have an answer anymore. I don't think Astrin or Goldberg have a particular answer, but just that possibly he overstates his case a little. And one of the ways out, I suggest, one of the ways out of the conundrum is to really look at the local spaces and see how, if there are Jews who cross the Mediterranean, in questions of communication, there are reading commentaries of Iberia together. they're translating works together. So there's cultural, intellectual, political, and economic movement and creating of sort of webs, networks, Mediterranean society. Clearly doesn't represent that many Jews. What does it mean for a guy in your town to have the context that make him who he is in another town? Right? They give him his wealth, they give him his worldview, that possibly give him the cachet by which he is able to become a big shot in your town. Perhaps being that big shot then gives him cachet to play the palace, to go and have an audience with the bishop or the king. How do those Mediterranean networks destabilize, change, direct internal Jewish life? I think very often they get cited as little more than, see, Jews aren't parochial. In fact, they are the anti-parochial. They are everyman. We're empires right now. Right? So they are very much in the age of empire. They're not confined by a local polity, right? They may not be, but others are. And how does the fact that they're not affect the local? I think that we have to be at least more aware of the fact that these people are involved outside of their local Alhama affects the way things run within the local Alhama, in order to really assess to what degree were they a Mediterranean society. Right? Also, I put that in there because Goldberg says really Spain wasn't part of Goethe's Mediterranean society as he claims, right? And others, Michael Talk and others have brought this up recently, and I think so. We're talking about, oh, this is the wrong one, sorry. Iberia and the Mediterranean. Maybe for the supposedly golden age of Jewish, Hispano-Jewish, or Andalusi-Jewish Mediterraneanness, they weren't that involved as we thought they were. Okay, Seth, you're frowning, so I'll pick you.
Yeah. You people, meaning medievalists, are you still talking about the Mediterranean? I guess that's what I don't.
Yes.
You know, I hear that you're talking about the Mediterranean, and I think it's okay to talk about the Mediterranean as long as you don't mean too much by it.
Okay.
Because a lot of the work of the post-Brodel Mediterraneanists was involved in trying to reduce the irreducible, which is Brodel,
right,
and to try to turn it into a set of, principles. And I mean, if you look even at the earliest sort of dedicated anthropological publications about the Mediterranean, the Tess collection of Peristiani, it's not easy to reduce that stuff to a single set of principles. So that, if you simply read Brodel or you read the Peristiani collection, it would be quite difficult to talk about a Mediterranean society. Goethein meant something totally different. Goethein just means stuff which is going on around the Mediterranean. But, so what does it mean to you people? this expression.
Somewhat evidently, it might mean something differently to me than the rest of my people. So, I mean, others can chime in if they want. It's a fair enough question. So very often we'll invoke these terms, subaltern, colonial, Mediterranean, and give a few bon mots and not necessarily really define our terms. But that's very popular. I mean, every day I get invitations or, listservs to conferences where it seems that it's assumed that there is something out there that we all know about, like the famous definition of pornography. You don't know what it is, but you see it, right? That it stands for, and then people will come up and say, well, for me, it stands for the anti-nation state, it stands for empire, it stands for multiculturalism, it stands for, right? And you might laugh, but there are.
Does it include Poland?
So then
Brodel thought it included Poland. Brodel thought it included Poland.
Well, Sarkozy's Union of the Mediterranean, which is the current definition, political definition of Mediterranean Union, does include Poland. It also includes Iceland, and it includes Yemen.
Right. Okay.
But I would also say that I don't want to say this too strongly. At times, that's deeper thinking than most people give to it. Right? It's this. We love it because it's an elastic term that people won't give us too much pushback on. When we say it, people will start nodding. And there are scores of articles produced in this format, right? And so for a Jew living in Spain, and Spain borders the Mediterranean, and the Jew does something, buys a loaf of bread, it's a Mediterranean act because of ipso facto. Yes. I also think that there are more articulate things that have been said that really, they say that the Mediterranean does stand for a willingness to adopt and adapt from outside, to pursue intercultural encounters, not to be caught within what a previous generation who are not as advanced as ours see as these little post holes of
There's a little village in the middle of England somewhere where they don't do that.
yeah.
But every
But what was that? But
every place else does that. You know, as long as they're near a road, they kind of more or less do that.
clearly you're to some degree preaching to the choir.
No, I know.
Right.
But that's so some that.
By all means, yeah.
Yeah, my question is more methodological than anything else. I understand exactly what it is that you're trying to do in challenging the perception of a fairly homogeneous collective existence in the middle of the Middle Ages, in the middle of Hispania. But the way in which you are trying to do that is to point to the internal dissension, the fractions, the fractures, the lines of force in that community. But I wonder the extent to which pointing to these internal fractions actually does away with the organic understanding of that community, in as much as just pointing to the fractions that may exist within a community doesn't necessarily open it up to the world, right? I mean, I thought that the more promising part of the project you were describing was when you're saying we should see the ways in which the various elements of this community dealt with the forces, pressures, lines of force, and arguments that were happening in the larger medieval context in Spain, right? And that is a way to almost give a new kind of citizenship, let's say, to the Jewish community. But then you have to wonder the extent to which you can keep that experience whole, in as much as at some point or another what will happen is that the life, as you very correctly said, I think that the life of a certain segment of that community is so completely disconnected from that of a lower segment that they're living in completely different worlds, right? So I guess what I'm arguing, what I'm not arguing, what I'm asking is the extent to which the maneuver, the strategy to underscore fractures within a community is itself necessarily a way to undermine the organicity of that community.
Right. I don't think that's what I'm doing, but I'm gonna take a minute here to think about if I am actually doing that. I think there's an organic, bounded community there. Organic is the wrong term. There is something that's identifiable at the time as the Jewish community of City X, right? Of Calatayud, of Toledo, wherever. It is governed by certain councilors, or at least officially. Whether the real governing goes behind in the back room someplace by some rich people who don't sit in the city council, that may be a second question. But the Jews in Toledo, and the Christians in Toledo, and the king of Toledo see the Jews of Toledo as a discrete entity, right? Whether I want to create them as citizens of the medieval world or not, they exist in at least some way as a discrete governed community. My argument is that if we want to understand how some of them converted, or some of them made deals with the bishop, or have some of them interacted in any ways with the world around them, we have to see how those resonances happen on both sides of that already notionally existent community, right? The boundaries, of course, are fuzzy at points. People cross them in different ways. They live outside the Jewish border, right? There's all the ways we can talk about fuzzy boundaries. But there is a community that they think exists and other thinking people exist. I don't think I'm trying to evaporate that community. It's not a goal of mine. It exists whether I want it to exist or not. My question is how the interactions of some people outside the community affect life within that community, right? I mean, I don't think it's anything greater than that. If you're interested in poetry across cultures, or you're interested in gender and the similarities of gender across cultures, or trade across cultures, that's great. That moment of interaction, that moment of boundary crossing, I think is very instructive and important. I'm also raising, how is it viewed back at home? And there is a back at home, whether we can, and I said, we can define back at home in different ways. Back at home is really just the Alhama of Toledo. It exists independently of the Alhamas of Castile. Or maybe we're talking about really the Jews of Castile, or maybe Sepharad, whatever that means, a rabbinic community sitting atop the Jews of a particular region. Right? We can construct those communities. We can point to the fact that they constructed their notional communities in a variety of ways. But I think that understanding how Jews in those communities interacted across the border has to include with it how that interaction resonated back at home, whatever that however we define back at home. And I think we can define it in multiple ways. Circles of poets, circles of mystics, women in a certain neighborhood, right? There's different ways you can do it.
Are there any other comments or
People are pacing.
questions? This is a wrap.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I would like to thank everyone for being here and to especially thank Jesus Rodriguez Velasco for the invitation. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our next speaker, Paula Tartakov. Professor Tartakov received her PhD in history right here at Columbia University in 2007. She is a recipient of many fellowships from prestigious institutions such as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, the Fulbright Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. And she has also been the winner of Presidential Fellowship of Teaching Excellence from Rutgers University. She is currently an associate professor for the Department of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University, where she works on a book project entitled Conversion to Judaism in Medieval Christendom, Reality, Fantasy, and Fear. Professor Tartakov's work has centered on social and cultural history of Jewish and Christian interactions in the medieval Mediterranean, and especially in questions of conversion and Jewish identity in the Crown of Aragon. In her first book, Between Christians and Jews, Conversion and Inquisition in the Medieval Crown of Aragon, which University of Pennsylvania Press published last year, she studies the phenomenon of the conversion of Jews to Christianity in the century preceding the 1391 pogroms that swept Aragon and Castile. Based on extensive archival research in Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia, Tartakov carefully reconstructs Jewish and Christian interactions prior to the policies of mass conversion of later decades, showing the complex web of pressures and constraints that characterize religious conversion despite the absence of a sustained, forcible policy of conversion. Her analysis richly documents the case of a conversion named Pera, who reverted to Judaism and turned himself into the Inquisition, as well as an impressive variety of minor threats meticulously culled from vast inquisitorial archives of Aragon. Her research offers us an especially detailed picture of conversion and reveals how the specific conflicts within local communities problematize the far better known interreligious tensions. In numerous cases, conversion to and from Christianity often appears to be an effective means of overstepping internal conflicts, the internal conflicts that she describes. At the same time, local religious communities continue to exert their influence over converts' lives well beyond conversion, often leading them to states of social marginalization and economic destitution that religious authorities and monarchs often sought to forestall. Paula Tartakov Paula Tartakov's path-breaking research has effectively reframed the evolving contours of medieval converso identities in terms of dispute over public space, contending jurisdictions, social and geographical mobility, and the circulation of property within medieval society. Professor Tartakov joins us today with a talk entitled Testing Boundaries, Jewish Conversion and Iberian Exceptions. Please join me here.
Thank you so much for this introduction, David and Jesus, for inviting me to speak today. It's a great honor to share the table with Jonathan Ray, Sofia Torayas-Tovar, and David Nierenberg, and it's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm especially honored to see several of my former professors here today, and I'm sorry only that Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, of blessed memory, to whom I owe so much, is no longer with us. I'm going to speak a little bit quickly so that we keep things moving this afternoon, so bear with me and let me know, please, if I should slow down. When one calls to mind the history of the Jews in Spain, the subject of Jewish conversion to Christianity inevitably looms large. The infamous Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of 1492 can hardly be discussed without reference to the thousands of conversions of the 14th and 15th centuries. Even in popular culture, the travails of these converts evoke endless fascination. Moreover, the complex identities of the converts of the 14th and 15th centuries and the ways they shaped the early modern world have become rich topics of study. For medieval historians, however, the conversions of the late 14th and 15th centuries are important additionally because they anchor two inescapable and intertwined historiographic narratives. One of these, introduced to Americans by the Inquisition scholar Henry Charles Lee in the late 19th century, posits that massacres and mass forced conversions of Jews across Spain in the year 1391, about which we'll hear more from David Nierenberg, marked the end of centuries of religious toleration, so to speak, in Spain, and ushered in a period of persecution that culminated in expulsion. According to this narrative, Spanish Jews were exceptional in having, pre-1391, long enjoyed fair relations with non-Jews, during a time when Ashkenazim, that is, Northern European Jews, allegedly endured unremitting persecution. This view overlaps with that of 19th century German Jewish scholars who famously contrasted a Spanish-Jewish golden age under Islamic rule with a lachrymose Ashkenazi experience. If this first historiographic narrative casts the mass conversions of 1391 as a watershed event in Spanish Jewish history, one that separated a period of exceptional tolerance from a period of persecution, a second narrative, given its fullest expression by the Jewish historian Yitzhak Beer in the 1930s and 40s, juxtaposes the mass conversions of 1391 in Spain to the numerous martyrdoms that took place at the start of the First Crusade much earlier in 1096 in Germany. This second narrative argues that whereas an Ashkenazi or Northern European penchant for martyrdom reflects pure and deep piety born of cultural isolation, a Sephardic penchant for conversion reflected Spanish Jews' excessive engagement with non-Jewish culture, in particular with Greek rationalism as mediated through Muslim scholarship. Although distinct in their approaches to and assessments of the Jews of medieval Spain, both of these classic narratives cast Spanish Jews as different from their Northern European counterparts, at least until 1391, on account of the nature of their interactions with non-Jews. Indeed, according to both of these narratives, one of the key characteristics that set Spanish Jews apart, for better or worse, was the fluidity of their cultural boundaries, their greater openness to non-Jewish ideas and ways. Over the past decades, both of these narratives have been challenged, including by my colleagues here, David and Jonathan, as scholars have developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations of Jewish history across medieval Europe. In my remarks today, I would like, in the context of this ongoing historiographic revision, to reconsider both the nature of the boundaries between Christians and Jews in Spain, and also the related putative boundaries between Spain and Northern Europe by examining a less familiar face of medieval Jewish conversion. instead of focusing on the violent mass conversions of 1391, I shall consider dozens of voluntary Jewish conversions to Christianity that took place in Spain during the century and a half leading up to 1391. And I'm defining voluntary conversions very loosely as conversions that were initiated by individual converts for personal reasons, as opposed to conversions that were imposed by Christians at Swords Point. I contend that the study of the experiences of voluntary converts bears unique potential to illuminate broader cultural dynamics, as in medieval Europe, religious conversion involved the ultimate testing of boundaries between communities and identities. Indeed, at least in theory, conversion was about effacing these boundaries. Within this framework this afternoon, I shall make three broad claims. First, very often in 13th and 14th century Spain, Jewish conversion to Christianity served primarily as a means of attempting to escape personal predicaments, and it bore the potential to do so precisely because, in spite of varying degrees of intimacy between individual Christians and Jews, Christian and Jewish societies in Christian Spain remained fundamentally separate and at odds. Second, the fates of voluntary converts in 13th and 14th century Spain lay bare the reluctance of most Christians and Jews to admit converts and returnees, respectively, into their communities, let alone believe that such individuals could actually become or return to being one of their own. This, in spite of Jewish and Christian leaders' encouragement of conversion and return to Judaism, respectively, and in spite of Jewish and Christian leaders' affirmations of the possibility of religious transformation. Third and last, these same dynamics, which reveal the limits of cultural fluidity in Christian Spain prior to 1391, existed north of the Pyrenees, where, according to traditional narratives, voluntary conversions were exceedingly rare. Indeed, by drawing on recent research on medieval Jewish conversion in Northern Europe, I shall argue that whereas certain boundaries between Christians and Jews in medieval Spain were in fact quite firm long before 1391, boundaries that historians have constructed around the Jews of medieval Spain, separating them from Ashkenazim in the minds of scholars, should be softened, in particular with regard to the centuries during which most of Spain was under Christian rule. The history of the Jews in Christian Spain, and specifically the history of Jewish-Christian relations in Spain, formed an integral part of the history of the Jews across Western Europe. I shall suggest also that an appreciation of this shared history, of the shared features of Jewish-Christian relations across 13th and 14th century Europe, can deepen our understanding of the ways in which later developments in Spain constituted an intensification of pre-existing European and not uniquely Spanish behaviors and patterns of thought. As I demonstrated in my book, Between Christian and Jew, in the framework of a broader investigation of early interactions between Jews, converts, and inquisitors, the year 1391 did not mark the beginning of Jewish conversion to Christianity in Spain. The fragmentary and uneven nature of evidence about medieval Jewish life, and especially about Jewish conversion, makes it impossible to know exactly how many conversions took place prior to 1391, let alone how these conversions broke down according to factors such as age, gender, sex, and geography. However, available documentation, including royal, papal, and episcopal correspondence, rabbinic responsa, records of almsgiving, and a variety of literary sources, leaves no question that voluntary conversions were a relatively familiar occurrence. Over 200 individual converts from Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia appear in documents between the years 1250 and 1391, a century and a half when record-keeping was spotty, and from which many documents have been lost. The ease with which the voluntary converts who are known to us procured baptism in northeastern Spain between 1250 and 1391 attests to the eagerness of the high medieval church to conquer Jewish souls. This enthusiasm is very well known. It drove vigorous, if largely ineffective, missionary efforts, which included public disputations, compulsory Jewish attendance at sermons, and the promulgation of legislation aimed at improving the lives of converts. Welcoming Jewish converts with open arms, popes permitted Jewish converts who were married within forbidden degrees of consanguinity to remain husband and wife. Clerics postponed catechesis until after baptism to speed things up, out of fear that the prospective convert might change his or her mind. And kings volunteered as godparents. Converting Jews was a Christian desideratum, first and foremost because, of course, spreading the good news was a fundamental Christian objective. Jewish conversion was especially meaningful to the church, however, on account of Christianity's unique relationship with Judaism. Christian theology dictated that for Christianity to be true, Judaism had to be false. Christianity's rapid spread and its political and military might were supposed to be evidence of God's favor. Moreover, Jews' abject fate, that is, the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, Jewish exile, and Jews' prescribed subordinate status in foreign lands, were said to signal Judaism's defeat. Yet Judaism's tenacity and the prosperity of many individual Jews were unsettling to Christians. And especially as the Middle Ages progressed, the church welcomed Jewish conversions as reassuring confirmations of Christianity's superiority to Judaism. In addition to illustrating the vitality of a Christian sense of rivalry with Judaism, a millennium after Ecclesia first touted its triumph over synagoga, ecclesiastical enthusiasm for Jewish conversion attests to Christian fear and suspicion of Jews. Jews were considered not only the arch villains in Christian secret history as the stubborn rejectors and alleged killers of Christ, but dangerous enemies still, as well poisoners and murderers of Christian boys. Turning Jews into Christians thus also served as a way of rendering Christendom more secure. This is a point emphasized, for example, by the Catalan Dominican theologian Ramon Martí. The experiences of converts in the 13th and 14th centuries in Spain draw our attention to these ideological issues of rivalry and suspicion, not only through the ease with which converts procured baptism, but also through the activities of some converts after baptism. In an effort to take advantage of Jewish-Christian tensions to gain Christian trust and find a niche for themselves, at least a dozen converts participated in anti-Jewish preaching and polemics in Spain prior to 1391. Additional converts turned on their former co-religionists by alerting Christian authorities to alleged Jewish anti-Christian activities, including anti-Christian blasphemy and host desecration. When we explore what it actually took to get Jews to seek baptism, however, we see that most conversions at root had little to do with theology or polemics, let alone with amicable interfaith relations. Instead, they were personal affairs. Most of the Jews who turned to baptism in northeastern Spain prior to 1391 were marginal individuals intent on escaping acute difficulties. Some hoped to avert or reduce punishments by Christian authorities, and more frequently, converts sought to escape conditions within the Jewish community. Some were bankrupt, some were desperate to exit a troubled marriage or to marry a Jewish partner who was forbidden by Jewish law, and some sought to sidestep the consequences of Jewish excommunication. Conversion was not appealing as far as extant documents allow us to see on account of spiritual or intellectual considerations, nor was it the product in any discernible way of particularly high degrees of Jewish acculturation in 13th or 14th century Spain. Instead, conversion to Christianity was often a decision born of despair and a way of getting as far as possible from the Jewish community. The great difficulties that many converts endured after baptism bring the despair that often drove conversion into sharp relief. Prospective converts were aware of the challenges they would face, yet they braved conversion anyway. Moreover, the difficulties that many converts endured demonstrate how even in contexts in which Jews and Christians lived and worked together more or less amicably, we presume, most Christians and Jews were reluctant to welcome converts and repentant apostates, respectively, into their communities as brethren. A small number of Jewish converts enjoyed professional success in Christian society. These included some anti-Jewish polemicists and some spectacularly wealthy individuals. For the majority, however, conversion was a grim business, for if baptism was easy to procure, integration into Christian society was not. Widespread popular Christian rejection of Jewish converts surely derived in part from the knowledge of many converts' worldly motivations and unsavory personal histories. There is no question, however, that converts' Jewish origins negatively predisposed Christians as well. Indeed, there existed a sense that Jewishness could never really be effaced, as it entailed membership in a nation or a gens. Moreover, as Yosef Haim Yerushalmi put it, today's Christian was still recognizable as yesterday's Jew. One could undergo baptism and thereby become Christian in the eyes of the church. But this official religious change did not correspond, it seems, to a change in popular Christian perceptions, which did not lose sight of converts' old selves. Ostracized and unable to support themselves, let alone gain Christian trust, not even by means of their anti-Jewish activities, dozens of Jewish converts, men, women, and children, became wandering beggars. Their physical homelessness, wrenching evidence of how the same suspicion of Jews that contributed to the church's conversionary zeal led also to the exclusion of Jewish converts from Christian society. If many Christians shunned Jewish converts, so too many Jews opposed re-Judaizing repentant apostates. Some converts, realizing that they would never find a place in Christian society, let alone be perceived as bona fide Christians, sought to return to Judaism. In this endeavor too, however, they encountered myriad obstacles. In the reluctance of Jewish society to readmit repentant apostates into the Jewish fold, which derived from a combination of resentment of apostates' treachery, fear of reprisals from the papal inquisition, and a sense that baptism and life among Christians had contaminated apostates, we sense opposition to returnees akin to that of Christians who spurned Jewish converts. Neither community, neither Jews nor Christians, neither community was enthusiastic about individuals from the other side joining their ranks. In the case of Jews, not even when those outsiders had started out as insiders. In Jewish responses to repentant apostates, however, we also find a counterpart, however rough, to the church authorities who encouraged movement into their faith and flock. For in spite of widespread popular Jewish opposition to re-Judaizing repentant apostates, a few Jewish communal leaders were willing to take on the risks involved in re-Judaizing repentant apostates. These rabbis required that repentant apostates perform public acts of penance to demonstrate their contrition. In addition, however, they addressed the concerns of Jews who felt that apostates had de facto ceased to be Jews, reluctantly condoning a rite for rehabilitating apostates that involved ritual immersion identical to that required of converts to Judaism. Like baptism, however, this washing did not necessarily lead to full status in one's new community. There was debate in particular as to whether repentant apostates, Baalei Teshuvah, who were originally of the Jewish priestly class, Kohanim, might resume their full prerogatives. These broad contours of the experiences of voluntary converts in Spain between 1250 and 1391 sharpen our understanding of the nature of boundaries between Christians and Jews during decades that are often still heralded as a period of exceptional interfaith harmony, in spite of sporadic outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence, for example, in 1320 and 1348. In Christian Spain, Jews and Christians could be neighbors, they could provide professional services for one another, and they could become business partners and friends. But these associations did not, at least not as far as our evidence